The Rot Beneath the Roots. In April of 1841, Silas Rutledge made an announcement that shocked even the cruelest plantation owners in South Carolina. He stood before the county's elite, men who measured their worth in human flesh and acres of rice, and declared the unthinkable. He was placing his daughter, Catherine, a 28-year-old woman weighing over 260 pounds, under the complete, unchecked authority of an enslaved man named Ezekiel Cross. Not as a nurse, not as a companion, but as her master in every way that mattered except on the deed of ownership. The white society of Culleton County was scandalized. Whispers flew behind fans in the parlors of Charleston and over brandy in the smoking rooms of the humid Low Country. They called it madness. They called it a perversion of the natural order. But they had no idea what Rutledge was truly doing or what Ezekiel Cross would do to Catherine over the following months. By November, Catherine's body had changed in ways no doctor could explain. 13 powerful men lay dead, and Cypress Grove Plantation was nothing but ash and ghosts. What really happened between that enslaved man and the plantation owner's daughter? What did he do to her that terrified everyone who witnessed it? To understand a fire, we must first understand the spark. We must go back to where it all began, before the blood, before the ash. Back to the oppressive spring of 1841. Spring in Culleton County did not arrive, it descended. It came with a wet, heavy heat that made the air feel solid, a physical weight pressing down on the lungs. The Combahee River moved sluggishly through the Low Country, its dark, tannic water reflecting the bearded Spanish moss that hung from the ancient live oak trees like funeral shrouds. It was a landscape of terrible beauty and hidden danger. Moccasins slid silently through the black water. Alligators watched from the mud banks with cold, prehistoric eyes. And stretching for miles were the rice paddies, the Carolina gold. These flooded fields were engineering marvels, a grid of dikes and trunks, worked by hundreds of enslaved people who moved through water up to their knees from the first gray light of dawn until the sun bled into the western horizon. The water teemed with mosquitoes carrying malaria, the miasma that the white owners fled from in the summer, retreating to the Pine Lands or Charleston. But the enslaved remained. They were the engine of this world, their lives consumed to produce the grain that filled the bellies of Europe and the pockets of the South. This was wealth built on suffering, prosperity extracted drop by drop from human misery, all of it justified by men who read their Bibles and convinced themselves that their cruelty was simply the natural order of things ordained by God. Cypress Grove Plantation sat on 800 acres of moderately productive land, wedged between the river and the dense pine forest. It was a place that smelled of tidal mud, jasmine, and old ambition. Its owner, Silas Rutledge, stood on the veranda of the main house, gripping the railing until his knuckles turned the color of parchment. He was a tall man, thin in the jagged way of someone who forgets to eat when consumed by obsession. His hair had gone gray prematurely, sweeping back from a high forehead that gave him a severe, hawkish appearance. His eyes were pale blue, cold and constantly moving, searching for flaws, for threats, for opportunities. Silas was a man trapped in the purgatory of the almost. He owned 58 enslaved people, which made him wealthy by the standards of the world. But in Culleton County, he was barely mid-tier. He was not one of the grand dynastic families like the Draytons or the Middletons. He did not own thousands of acres. He did not have a summer home on the Battery in Charleston. When the true elites held their balls, Silas was invited, but he was seated at the edge of the room. When business deals were struck in the back rooms of the banks, he was informed of the outcome, never asked for his input. He desperately wanted to be inside that inner circle. He wanted his name to carry the weight that could open doors or destroy reputations with a single word. Getting slow in the lower quadrant, Silas muttered to himself, watching a line of figures moving in the distance. He pulled a gold pocket watch from his vest, a watch he couldn't strictly afford, and checked the time. Efficiency is slipping. He turned and walked back into the house. The interior of Cypress Grove was designed to impress, but to a discerning eye, the cracks showed. The velvet on the fainting couch was worn at the seams. The silver service on the sideboard was plated, not solid. The portraits on the walls were of ancestors Silas had largely invented to give himself a lineage he didn't possess. He walked past the grand staircase that led to the second floor. He paused, looking up into the gloom of the landing. From upstairs, there was no sound, no footsteps, no music. music, just a heavy, suffocating silence. His daughter was up there, Catherine. The thought of her made his stomach tighten with a mixture of shame and resentment. She was 28 years old, a spinster, a recluse, and she was enormous. 260 pounds of flesh, swollen and distorted by years of medication and lethargy. The doctors called it hysteria or female nervous disorder. They prescribed mercury, arsenic tonics, and heavy doses of laudanum. Silas continued to his study, closing the heavy oak door behind him. This was his sanctuary. The walls were lined with ledgers, not literature. He sat at his desk, a massive piece of mahogany that dominated the room, and stared at the pile of correspondence. He was drowning. Gambling had started as a way to socialize with the elite men he envied. A game of whist here, a horse race there. But Silas lacked the casual indifference of the truly rich. When they lost $1,000, they laughed. When Silas lost, he panicked, and when he panicked, he doubled down. Investments in a failed cotton speculation in Alabama had wiped out his cash reserves 2 years ago. Now, he was leveraging the next harvest before the seed was even in the ground. A knock at the door broke his reverie. "Enter," Silas barked. It was Thomas, the house butler. Thomas was an elderly man, his back stooped, his face a mask of practiced neutrality. He carried a silver tray. On it sat a single letter. "Courier just brought this, Master Silas. Said it was for your hands only." Silas frowned. "A courier? Not the post. Private courier, sir, from Charleston." Silas took the letter. The paper was thick, creamy, and expensive. There was no return address, but the seal on the back stopped his breath in his throat. It was red wax, stamped with a distinct, chilling symbol, a scythe crossed with wheat stalks. The mark of the brethren of the harvest. Thomas waited. Silas waved a hand dismissively, his voice trembling slightly. "That will be all, Thomas. Close the door." As soon as the latch clicked, Silas ripped the envelope open. His hands, usually so steady when whipping a man or counting coins, were shaking violently. He knew the brethren. God help him. He knew them. They were a society of 13 men, the architects of the county. They gathered in darkness, usually in the deep cellars of the old Huguenot church or in the private crypts of the plantation owners, to perform rituals they believed strengthened the land. They mixed high society Freemasonry with twisted interpretations of ancient European paganism and stolen bits of spiritualism from the very people they enslaved. They believed that power was a finite resource and it had to be taken. They believed the soil demanded blood to yield gold. Silas had been initiated in 1822, desperate for their patronage. He remembered the night vividly, the masks, the chanting in a language that sounded like Latin but wasn't, the smell of copper and iron. He had wanted to belong so badly that he had suppressed his nausea, suppressed his morality, and done what they asked. He unfolded the letter. There were 3 pages. "Brother Rutledge," it began. The handwriting was elegant, sharp, and merciless. "The Ledger of the Harvest is reviewed quarterly. It has come to the attention of the inner circle that your contributions, both financial and spiritual, have fallen into arrears. Your current debt, arising from the promissory notes held by Judge Pelham and the losses incurred at the St. Cecilia tables, stands at $12,000. Silas felt the blood drain from his face. 12,000. It was an impossible sum. It was more than the value of his next 3 harvests combined. To pay it, he would have to sell everything. The land, the house, the slaves. He would be destitute. He would be cast out of society, a laughingstock, a failure. He read on. "However, the brethren value loyalty over currency, provided that loyalty is absolute. We offer an alternative to liquidation." Silas leaned closer to the candlelight, his heart hammering against his ribs. "It has been noted that your daughter, Catherine, suffers from a malady of the spirit and body. The brethren require a demonstration of the natural order, the absolute dominance of will over flesh. You are to participate in the ritual of inversion. You will take your daughter and place her under the complete, unsupervised authority of an enslaved man for a period of 1 solar year. This man must be given total control over her person, her diet, her discipline, and her daily existence. You will announce this publicly as a radical medical intervention. You will strip her of her status and place her beneath the lowest in your household. This humiliation serves a dual purpose. It breaks the final chains of vanity that bind you, Silas, proving you value the brotherhood above your own blood. And it serves as an experiment in the malady malleability of the human soul. If you agree, your debt is forgiven in full. Furthermore, the brethren will finance the expansion of your drainage systems for the coming season. Refuse, and the notes will be called in on the 1st of May. Silas dropped the letter on the desk. He stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the live oaks. Sacrifice his daughter, not to death, at least not necessarily, but to something arguably worse in the eyes of his society. To give a slave power over a white woman, it was taboo. It was illegal in spirit, if not in letter. It would make him a pariah to the uninitiated, a confusing object of pity and scorn. But to the brethren, it would make him a king. He thought of Catherine. He thought of the disappointment she represented. Her mother, Elizabeth, had been practical, sharp, and useful. Catherine was a burden, a heavy, drug-addled anchor dragging him down. She embarrassed him. When guests came, she had to be hidden away. She had fits. She screamed things, terrible things about the past, about memories he had tried to scruff from her mind with laudanum. Last year, she had attacked him with a letter opener. The scar on his left hand throbbed at the memory. She is broken anyway, the voice in his head whispered. The doctors can't fix her. Maybe this is the only way to silence her, or cure her, or perhaps it doesn't matter, as long as Cypress Grove survives. It was a transaction. That's how Silas Rutledge viewed the world. Debits and credits. Catherine was a depreciating asset. Cypress Grove was his legacy. The choice was monstrous, but Silas had been practicing monstrosity for 19 years. He had learned that conscience was just a weakness to be bred out like a limp in a racehorse. He returned to his desk. He dipped his quill into the inkwell. He did not tremble this time. He wrote a single sentence on a fresh sheet of paper. I accept the terms of the harvest. He sealed it with his own ring. Then he rang the bell for Thomas. Take this to the courier. Immediately, as Thomas left, Silas unlocked a drawer in his desk and pulled out a bottle of brandy. He poured a glass and drank it in one swallow. The burn felt good. It felt like decision. 3 days later, the second letter arrived. It contained no threats, only instructions. It contained a name, Ezekiel Cross. The letter described him briefly, age 33. Purchased recently through an intermediary from a Virginia plantation. Skills, carpentry, reading, illicit but noted, and herbal medicine. Temperament, quiet, obedient. But the letter left out the most important details. It didn't mention that Ezekiel Cross had lost a wife and 2 children to the auction block 3 years ago. It didn't mention that the man who had signed the bill of sale for that family separation, the man who had torn them apart to settle a gambling debt in Virginia, was a visiting speculator named Silas Rutledge. Silas didn't remember the man he had broken. To him, it had been just another Tuesday, another ledger entry. But Ezekiel remembered. Upstairs, the room smelled of stale lavender, unwashed linen, and the sweet, metallic rot of sickness. Catherine Rutledge sat in a heavy armchair by the cold fireplace. The curtains were drawn tight, pinning the room in a permanent twilight. She stared at a dust mote floating in a sliver of light that had managed to escape through a gap in the velvet drapes. Her body felt like it belonged to someone else. It was heavy, a cage of flesh that trapped her. Her fingers were swollen, the rings she used to wear now cutting into the skin, so she had taken them off months ago. She reached for the small glass vial on the side table. Her hand trembled violently, a coarse, rhythmic shaking that rattled the glass against the wood. She tipped the vial back. The laudanum tasted bitter and thick. It coated her throat. Quiet, she whispered to the empty room. Make it quiet. The drug was the only thing that stopped the screaming in her head. It was the only thing that blurred the edges of the memory. The memory of the cellar. The memory of being 12 years old and hiding behind a barrel of salted pork. The memory of the chanting. The memory of the blood. Her father told her she was mad. He brought doctors from Charleston and Savannah. They bled her with leeches. They gave her pills that made her teeth loose and her hair thin. They told her that her memories were hysterical delusions, the product of a diseased female mind. For years, she had fought them. She had screamed the truth at dinner parties until she was dragged away. She had written letters that were intercepted and burned. But eventually, the drugs had won. The laudanum made it easier to agree. Yes, father, I am sick. Yes, father, I imagined it. It was easier to be mad than to accept that her father was a monster. But deep down, beneath the layers of opium and despair, a tiny ember still burned. A hatred so pure and cold it could freeze the sun. She heard a carriage approaching outside. The gravel crunched under heavy wheels. It wasn't the doctor's buggy. It was something heavier, a wagon. She didn't have the energy to stand and look. She closed her eyes and let the drug pull her down into the dark water of sleep. She didn't know that the wagon carried the instrument of her her destruction, or perhaps her salvation. The arrival. Ezekiel Cross sat in the back of the wagon, his back against the rough wood slats. The chains on his ankles clinked softly with every bump in the road, a rhythm he had known for most of his life. He was a tall man, broad in the shoulders, with skin the color of deep, polished mahogany. His face was a mask of indifference, but his eyes were sharp, intelligent, and currently fixed on the passing landscape. He knew where he was going. He had spent 2 years engineering this. 2 years of playing the part of the dumb brute, then the skilled carpenter, then the obedient herbalist. 2 years of getting sold, moving south, tracking the man who had destroyed his life. He touched his chest, feeling the crinkle of paper beneath his shirt. A list of 3 names. Sarah, Benjamin, Ruth. He didn't know if they were alive or dead. The Alabama fever camps were notorious, but he knew who had sent them there. The wagon turned through a massive iron gate. An archway of oak trees dripped with moss, creating a tunnel of shadows. At the end of the tunnel sat the house. Cypress Grove. It was white, pillared, and imposing. It looked like a temple. Ezekiel knew it was a tomb. The driver, a slave trader named Henderson, spit tobacco juice over the side. "Here we are, boy. End of the line. You better behave for Rutledge. I hear he's a strange one. Strict." Ezekiel didn't answer. He watched the house. He saw a curtain twitch in an upstairs window. He saw the figure of a man step out onto the porch, a man with gray hair and a nervous energy. Silas Rutledge. Ezekiel's heart did not race. His breathing did not hitch. A cold calm settled over him. The calm of a hunter who has finally cornered the wolf. The wagon stopped. Henderson hopped down. "Got your delivery, Mr. Rutledge." Henderson called out. Ezekiel Cross. Just as the order specified. Silas walked down the steps. He didn't look at Henderson. He looked at Ezekiel. For a moment, the 2 men locked eyes. Master and slave. Silas expected to see fear. He expected to see the dull submission he was used to. Instead, Ezekiel looked back at him with a gaze that was terrifyingly direct. It wasn't disrespectful exactly. It was assessing. It was the look of a man measuring a coffin. "Unchain him," Silas ordered, his voice tight. "You sure, sir? He's a big buck. Strong." "I said unchain him. He has work to do." As the iron cuffs fell from his ankles, Ezekiel rubbed the skin. He stood up to his full height, towering over Silas by 3 inches. "You understand your purpose here?" Silas asked, tried to assert dominance, tried to puff himself up. "I am here to serve, sir," Ezekiel said. His voice was deep, resonant, and carried a trace of the educated cadence of Virginia, though he tried to hide it. "You are here," Silas said, stepping closer, lowering his voice so the driver couldn't hear, "because I have a problem that requires a unique solution. My daughter is unwell. You are to be her guardian, her jailer, her master." Silas paused, waiting for the shock to register on the slave's face. Ezekiel didn't blink. "As you command, sir. You will begin tomorrow," Silas said, unnerved by the man's stillness. "You will be quartered in the cabin nearest the kitchen. Do not speak to the other slaves more than necessary. Do not leave the grounds, and do not fail me, or you will wish you had died in Virginia." "I understand," Ezekiel said. Silas turned and walked back up the stairs, fleeing the intensity of Ezekiel's presence. Ezekiel watched him go. He looked at the house, then at the upstairs window where the curtain had twitched. The daughter, he thought. The leverage. He picked up his small bundle of belongings. He wasn't just walking into a new plantation. He was walking into a war. And for the first time in 19 years, Silas Rutledge had just invited the enemy inside the gates. Ezekiel took his first step onto the soil of Cypress Grove. The ground felt soft, ready to accept the dead. Soon, Ezekiel whispered to the wind. Soon, the dawn of April 14th broke over Cypress Grove with a deceptive serenity. A mist clung to the rice paddies, turning the world into a watercolor of soft grays and greens. But inside the main house, the air was stagnant, heavy with the invisible weight of secrets kept too long in the dark. Ezekiel Cross woke before the sun. His cabin was a small, rough-hewn structure set apart from the main slave quarters, a deliberate isolation engineered by Silas Rutledge to emphasize Ezekiel's strange limbo status. He was not field hand, nor house staff. He was something else, a jailer. Ezekiel washed his face in a basin of cold water. He stared at his reflection, practicing the mask. He smoothed the intelligence from his brow, relaxed the tension in his jaw. He had to look capable enough to control a madwoman, but subservient enough not to threaten a white man. It was a razor's edge he had walked for 2 years. At 7 a.m., a house slave named Judith appeared at his door. She was a middle middle-aged woman with graying hair wrapped in a stiff kerchief and eyes that had seen everything and said nothing. She held a ring of keys. "Master Silas has gone to the fields," she said, her voice low. "He says you are to go up now. He says good luck." Ezekiel stepped out into the morning air. "Tell me about her, Judith." Judith hesitated. She looked toward the big house, then back at Ezekiel with a mixture of pity and warning. "She ain't right, son. The spirits occupy her. She screams at things ain't there. She throws things, and Judith lowered her voice to a whisper. "She has a darkness in her. Don't turn your back." Ezekiel nodded. "Thank you." They walked in silence to the back entrance of the main house, up the narrow servant's staircase that smelled of lye soap and old wood. They reached the second floor. Judith stopped before a heavy oak door at the end of the hall. She unlocked it, the mechanism stiff with disuse. "Miss Catherine," Judith called out, her voice trembling slightly. "Your father has brought someone for your treatments." A crash from inside. The sound of porcelain shattering against a wall. "Get out!" A voice screamed. It was a ruined voice, slurred, wet, and vibrating with a frantic, animalistic rage. "I said no more doctors. Tell him I'll kill the next one." Judith flinched. She looked at Ezekiel, practically begging him to turn back. "She has bad days. This is a bad day." Ezekiel reached past her and took the door handle. His hand was steady. "Leave us, Judith." "But Sir said, leave us." Judith fled. Ezekiel turned the handle and pushed the door open. He stepped inside and closed it firmly behind him, the latch clicking like the hammer of a gun. The room was a cave. Heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight, sealing out the morning. The air was thick, almost unbreathable. It smelled of unwashed bedding, stale sweat, chamber pots, and rising above it all, the sickly sweet, metallic chemical tang of laudanum and mercury. It was the smell of a slow death. Ezekiel's eyes adjusted to the gloom. The room was a wreck. Books were scattered across the floor, their spines broken. A tray of untouched food rotted on a side table. In the center of the chaos, sitting in a wing-back chair facing the dead hearth, was a mountain of white linen. Catherine Rutledge. She was massive, her body swollen by years of inactivity and fluid retention caused by the poison she was fed. She wore a stained dressing gown that had once been fine silk. Her dark hair was a matted tangle hanging over her face. Her hands, resting on the arms of the chair, trembled with a violent, ceaseless rhythm. She didn't turn around. She was panting, clutching a heavy brass candlestick as a weapon. "Who are you?" she hissed, not looking at him. "Which butcher did he send this time? Are you here to bleed me or burn me?" Ezekiel didn't answer immediately. He walked silently across the rug. He moved not with the shuffling gait expected of a slave, but with the quiet predation of a panther. He stopped 5 feet from her. "I'm not a doctor, Miss Catherine," he said. His voice was calm, deep, and devoid of the servile accent he used with Silas. "And I have no interest in your blood." The change in tone made her freeze. The trembling in her hands paused for a microsecond. She turned her head slowly. Her face was a tragedy. Puffy, pale as dough, with dark bruises of exhaustion under eyes that swam in a glassy haze. But beneath the bloat and the drug haze, Ezekiel saw the structure of the woman she had been and the fire of the woman she could be. "You." She squinted, her vision likely blurred by the opiates. "You're the one from the wagon, the slave. My name is Ezekiel." Catherine let out a harsh, jagged laugh. "A slave doctor. My father has finally lost his mind completely. Or maybe he just wants to humiliate me one last time before I die. He has given me absolute authority over you," Ezekiel said, stepping closer. "For 1 year, I decide what you eat. I decide when you sleep. I decide if you live." Catherine gripped the candlestick tighter. "Try to touch me, and I will split your skull. I don't care what he told you. I'm still a Rutledge." "Are you?" Ezekiel asked. He walked past her, ignoring the weapon, and went to the window. "A Rutledge commands respect. A Rutledge has power. You have this room. You have your pills. You have your fear." He grabbed the heavy velvet curtains and ripped them open. The sound of the rings sliding on the rod was like a shriek. Brilliant, merciless spring sunlight flooded the room, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. Catherine screamed. She threw her hands up to cover her eyes, dropping the candlestick. It thudded dully on the carpet. "Stop it. It burns. Close it." "When was the last time you saw the sun, Catherine?" Ezekiel asked, turning to face her, his silhouette framed by the blinding light. "I can't. I'm sick. The light hurts my head." She was weeping now, rocking back and forth. "I need my medicine. Give me the bottle. It's on the table. Please." Ezekiel walked to the small table. He picked up the amber glass bottle. It was half full of the dark, viscous liquid, laudanum, mixed with whatever heavy metals the local quacks thought cured female hysteria. He uncorked it. He sniffed it. It smelled of a oblivion. The doctors say this helps you, Ezekiel said. Yes, it stops the shaking. It stops the voices. She reached out a hand, fingers grasping at the air. Give it to me. Ezekiel walked over to the fireplace. He tilted the bottle. No, Catherine shrieked, trying to heave her heavy body out of the chair. He poured the contents onto the cold ashes. The thick liquid glugged out, forming a black puddle that soaked into the soot. What have you done? Catherine wailed, collapsing back into the chair, sobbing like a child. You've killed me. The pain is coming back. Ezekiel knelt in front of her. He was close enough now to smell the sourness of her skin, close enough to see the dilated, terrified pupils of her eyes. Listen to me, he commanded. He didn't shout, but the intensity of his voice cut through her panic. Look at me. She looked. She saw a man who was not afraid. A man who was not looking at her with disgust, but with a fierce, demanding expectation. What if the doctors are wrong? Ezekiel asked. The question hung in the air. What? She whispered. What if you aren't sick? Ezekiel pressed. What if everything you have been told about your condition is designed not to help you, but to keep you like this? What if your father has been poisoning you for years to ensure you never become well enough to speak about what you saw? Silence. Absolute, ringing silence. The sobbing stopped. Catherine stared at him. The gears of her mind, rusted by years of sedation, began to turn, grinding against the sludge of the drugs. What I saw, she murmured. Her eyes lost focus, drifting back to a memory of a cellar, of blood, of men in masks. Then they snapped back to Ezekiel. He told you. He told you about the cellar. He told me nothing. Ezekiel lied. But I have eyes. I know mercury poisoning. I know what long-term opiate use does to a human soul. Healthy women do not become this without someone working very hard to make them that way. Catherine's breathing hitched. Why? She asked, her voice small. Why tell me this? You belong to him. If he knows you pour that out, he won't know. Ezekiel said. Not yet. This is a trick, she whispered, suspicion creeping back in. He said you'd test me, to see if I'm still fighting. I can help you, Ezekiel said, ignoring her doubt. I can make you clear-minded. I can make you strong enough to walk out of this room. Strong enough to stand before him and say what you know. It's impossible, she said. I'm too weak. You are weak because he wants you weak, Ezekiel said. But stopping will be brutal, Catherine. Your body is dependent. You will feel pain like you have never known. You will fever. You will vomit. You will beg me to kill you. And your father cannot know we are doing it. We have to pretend you are still taking the medicine while I feed you herbs to flush the poison out. Catherine studied him. For the first time, she really looked at him. She saw the calluses on his hands. She saw the intelligence he usually hid. Why? She asked again. Why would you help me? What is Silas Rutledge to you? Ezekiel sat back on his heels. He decided to gamble everything. He sold my family, Ezekiel said. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a tombstone. My wife, Sarah, my son, Benjamin, my daughter, Ruth. He sold them 3 years ago in Virginia. He split us up not for money, but to prove a point to his friends. He sent them to Alabama to die. Ezekiel's eyes hardened. I spent 2 years finding him. I got myself sold here on purpose. I am not here to nurse you, Catherine. I am here to burn Silas Rutledge's world to the ground. Catherine stared at him. The fog in her eyes seemed to recede, replaced by a spark of recognition. She knew that look. It was the same look she saw in the mirror on her darkest days. You want revenge, she stated. I want justice, Ezekiel corrected, but I will settle for ruin. Catherine sat up straighter. The effort made her grimace, but she did it. If I do this, if I survive this, what happens then? Then we act, Ezekiel said. We find out what the brethren are planning, and we destroy them. Catherine was silent for a long time. She looked at the puddle of laudanum in the fireplace. She looked at her trembling hands. Then she looked at Ezekiel. I want them all dead, she whispered. The venom in her voice was shocking. My father, Judge Pelham, Reverend Crenshaw, all of them. Every man who stood in that cellar and chanted while, she couldn't finish the sentence. She took a shaky breath. If we are conspirators, Ezekiel, you must know something. What is that? Catherine leaned forward, her eyes glittering with a terrifying lucidity. They say I am mad. They say I'm harmless. But I have killed before. Ezekiel felt a chill run down his spine. What? 3 people, she said, a cruel smile touching her lips. House slaves. Years ago, they caught me during a lucid moment. They were going to tell my father I was writing things down. I put ground glass in their stew. They died screaming. My father covered it up. He told everyone they ran away. She leaned back, watching him closely. I am a monster, Ezekiel, just like him. So if you plan to betray me, remember, I don't need a weapon to kill. I just need an opportunity. Ezekiel looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the capacity for violence. He saw the broken moral compass, but he also saw a weapon he could aim. I believe you, Ezekiel said solemnly, and I will not betray you. Good. Catherine extended a swollen, trembling hand. Then help me. Help me get up. Ezekiel took her hand. The purge. The pact was sealed, but the payment was due immediately. The first 6 hours were manageable. Catherine complained of a headache. She was irritable, but as the sun began to set, the true withdrawal set in. It started with the sweat. It poured off her, soaking the sheets within minutes. It smelled sour like vinegar and fear. Then came the cramps. Catherine curled into a fetal position, a massive, shuddering mound on the bed, screaming into her pillow. Her muscles, starved of the opiate that had relaxed them for years, began to spasm. Her legs kicked involuntarily. Make it stop, she shrieked, clawing at the mattress. Ezekiel, give it to me. Just a drop. Please, God, just a drop. Ezekiel sat by the bed. He had brought a bucket of cool water and a rag. He wiped her forehead. Breathe, he said. This is the poison leaving. This is the weakness burning away. I hate you, she screamed, spitting at him. You devil, you black bastard. I'll have you whipped. I'll have you skinned. Ezekiel didn't flinch. He knew this wasn't Catherine. This was the addiction talking. He held her down when she tried to thrash off the bed. He forced water between her cracked lips when she refused to drink. By midnight, the vomiting began. It was violent and black. She heaved until there was nothing left, and then she heaved bile. Ezekiel held the basin. He cleaned her up, changing the sheets with efficient strength, lifting her heavy body as if she weighed nothing. He brewed a tea from the herbs he had smuggled in. Valerian root for the spasms, milk thistle for the liver, and willow bark for the pain. Drink, he ordered, holding the cup to her lips. It tastes like dirt, she wept. It tastes like life, he countered. Drink. She drank, and then she cried. She cried for hours, a low, keening wail that sounded like a morning song. She cried for her lost years. She cried for the mother she never knew. She cried for the girl who had hidden behind a barrel and seen too much. Ezekiel sat in the chair by the window, keeping vigil. He held the cloth bundle with his family's names in his hand, squeezing it every time Catherine screamed. Pain for pain, he thought. Suffering for suffering. Around 3 a.m., the door handle turned. Ezekiel was across the room in a heartbeat, blocking the door. Who is it? It's Silas. The voice came from the hallway. I heard screaming. Is she resisting? Ezekiel cracked the door open just an inch. He kept his face in the shadows. She is resisting, sir, Ezekiel said calmly. She is fighting for dominance. But I have her under control. The discipline is being applied. Silas paused. He seemed to interpret the screams of withdrawal as screams of punishment. Good, he whispered, a sick satisfaction in his voice. Break her spirit, Ezekiel. Do not spare the rod. I will do what is necessary, sir. Good night. Silas walked away. Ezekiel closed the door and locked it. He turned back to the bed. Catherine was watching him, her eyes wide, bloodshot, and terrified. She had heard her father. She had heard him give permission for her torture. You want me to hurt? She whispered. He wants you broken, Ezekiel said, returning to her side. He dipped the rag in the cool water again. But we're going to make you unbreakable. He wiped her face. Rest now, Catherine. The dawn is coming, and we have to do this all over again tomorrow. She closed her eyes, her hand gripping his wrist with a desperate strength. Don't leave, she mumbled, drifting into a feverish sleep. I'm not going anywhere, Ezekiel promised. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the Spanish moss. The plantation slept, unaware that in the upstairs room, a forge had been lit. Two broken people were being hammered into something new, something sharp, something deadly. And Silas Rutledge slept soundly, dreaming of his debts being paid, never realizing that the currency would be his own blood. The forge of summer. May dissolved into June, and with it, the low country transformed into a green, suffocating hell. The heat rose from the earth in shimmering waves, distorting the horizon. The air grew so thick with humidity and the drone of cicadas that breathing felt like inhaling warm soup. Inside the shuttered room on the second floor of Cypress Grove, a different kind of atmosphere was brewing. It was a crucible. The acute violence of the withdrawal had passed. The vomiting and the seizures had subsided, replaced by a dull, aching hollowness that Catherine described as being scraped out with a rusted spoon. She was no longer screaming, but she was fragile, a porcelain doll that had been shattered and glued back together with trembling hands. Ezekiel became a ghost in the house. He moved between the kitchen garden, the woods at the edge of the property, and Catherine's room. To the other slaves, he was an enigma, the man who lived in the white folks' air. To Silas Rutledge, he was a surprisingly effective jailer. But inside the room, the dynamic was intricate, intimate, and dangerous. Ezekiel had instituted a regime of absolute strictness. He removed the soft, feathery pillows, replacing them with firm bolsters to align her spine. He controlled every morsel of food. No more heavy creams, no sugared pastries, no pork dripping in grease. He brought her broth made from bones and wild onions. He brought her salads of bitter greens, dandelion to flush the kidneys, chicory to stimulate digestion. He brought her teas brewed from nettle and red clover. "I am starving," Catherine would moan, lying on the rug where Ezekiel forced her stretch. Her body was still heavy, but the bloating was receding, leaving her skin loose and pale. "You are not starving," Ezekiel would say from his chair, whittling a piece of oak with a small knife. "You are eating for fuel, not for oblivion. There is a difference. It tastes like grass. It tastes like poverty. It tastes like clarity," he countered. "Stand up. 10 more steps." "I can't." Ezekiel would stop whittling. He would look at her with those dark, unyielding eyes. "Did you forget the cellar, Catherine? Did you forget what you want to do to them?" The mention of the cellar always worked. It was the spur he dug into her flank. Catherine would grit her teeth, her face flushing with a mixture of shame and rage, and she would stand. She would walk the length of the room. Once, twice, sweat dripping from her nose, her legs shaking under the weight she still carried. But she walked. The performance. The greatest danger wasn't the detox. It was Silas. Every Sunday evening, promptly at 6 p.m., Silas Rutledge came to inspect his property. These visits were a terrifying theater piece that Ezekiel and Catherine had to improvise perfectly. If Silas suspected for a moment that Ezekiel was treating her with compassion or that Catherine was regaining her agency, the game would be over. Ezekiel would be sold or killed, and Catherine would be drugged back into silence. On the third Sunday of June, the door handle rattled. "He's here," Catherine hissed. She was sitting by the window, reading a book Ezekiel had stolen from the library. She scrambled up, her movements clumsy but faster than before. "On the floor," Ezekiel commanded, his voice dropping to a harsh growl. "Head down. Do not look at him." Catherine dropped her knees on the rug, bowing her head. Ezekiel stood over her, his posture shifting from guardian to overseer. He crossed his arms, making his biceps bulge. Silas entered. He was dressed for dinner, smelling of bay rum and brandy. He held a handkerchief to his nose, as if the very air of his daughter's room was infectious. "Report," Silas demanded, looking at the top of Catherine's head with disdain. "Progress is slow, master," Ezekiel said, injecting a note of frustration into his tone. "The subject is stubborn. She refuses food. She weeps, but she is learning obedience." "Is she?" Silas stepped closer. He nudged Catherine's shoulder with the toe of his polished boot. It wasn't a kick, but the disrespect of it, touching her like she was a sack of meal, made Ezekiel's hand twitch. "Look at me, girl," Silas snapped. Catherine raised her head. She had practiced this. She let her jaw go slack. She made her eyes wide and vacant, suppressing the intelligence that was returning to them. She let a line of drool escape the corner of her mouth. "Father," she slurred. "Please let me sleep." Silas stared at her. He looked for the fire, the hysteria. He saw only defeat. He smiled. It was a cold, thin expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Excellent," Silas murmured. He looked at Ezekiel. "You have a talent for breaking things, boy. I was worried you might be too soft. It seems the brethren chose well." "I'll only do as you commanded, sir. Total authority." "Keep at it," Silas said, turning to leave. "She looks thinner, less monstrous. Perhaps by November, she will be presentable enough to be seen. Or perhaps not. It matters little as long as she is compliant." When the door clicked shut and the footsteps faded down the hall, the tension in the room snapped like a cut wire. Catherine slumped back on her heels, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. The vacant look vanished, replaced by a cold fury. "He kicked me," she whispered. "He nudged you," Ezekiel corrected, offering her a hand to help her up. "He touched me with his boot," she spat, gripping Ezekiel's hand. Her grip was stronger now. "When the time comes, Ezekiel, I want his legs first." Ezekiel looked at her. The transformation was happening faster than he expected. The fat was melting away, revealing a woman made of iron and resentment. He was forging a blade, but he was beginning to wonder if he would be able to control it once it was sharp. "Patience," Ezekiel said. "First the legs, then the neck." But not yet. The journal. July brought the storms. Violent thunderstorms rolled off the Atlantic, battering the house with rain that sounded like gravel thrown against the siding. During one such storm, while lightning flashed through the gaps in the curtains. Catherine made her decision. She had been watching Ezekiel for 3 months. She had watched him nurse her, clean her, push her, and protect her. She had seen him looking at the family names written on that scrap of paper he kept in his pocket. She knew his hate was as deep as hers. Ezekiel, she said. She was standing by the fireplace. She had lost nearly 40 pounds. Her face had angles now. Her cheekbones were visible, sharp ridges beneath pale skin. Yes, miss. Stop calling me Mississippi. We are past that. She walked to the bookshelf in the corner. It was a heavy, mahogany piece filled with dull religious tracts and novels she hadn't touched in years. She reached for a thick, leather-bound copy of Pilgrim's Progress. My father never reads, she said quietly. He buys books by the yard to fill the shelves, but he never opens them. That was his mistake. She pulled the book down. She opened it. The center of the pages had been hollowed out with a razor, creating a secret compartment. Inside sat a small, black notebook. Ezekiel stepped closer, the thunder rumbling low in his chest. What is that? Evidence, Catherine said. I wasn't always drugged, Ezekiel. Before the laudanum took me completely, there were nights I pretended to be asleep. Nights I crept down the servants' stairs to the cellar door. Nights I listened. She handed him the book. I wrote it all down. Dates, names, what they said, what they did. Ezekiel took the notebook. His large, calloused hands handled it delicately. He opened the first page. The handwriting was erratic, sometimes frantic, written in charcoal or stolen ink. October 31st, 1838. The harvest moon. Present. Father, Judge Pelham, Mr. Fanning, Dr. Arrington. They brought a girl, enslaved, from a Fanning plantation, maybe 16 years old. They called her the sheaf. They didn't kill her. Not at first. They bled her into a silver bowl. They drank it mixed with wine. They chanted about the soil needing life. Ezekiel felt a wave of nausea, followed instantly by a cold, murderous clarity. He flipped the page. March 20th, 1839. The vernal equinox. Father is worried about money. The brethren told him the sacrifice was insufficient. They said the great debt requires a great payment. They spoke of the inversion. Ezekiel looked up. The inversion? Catherine nodded, her face pale in the lightning flash. Read the entry for April of this year, 2 days before you arrived. Ezekiel flipped to the end of the written pages. April 10th, 1841. I heard them in the study. Judge Pelham was shouting. He said father had to choose. The money or the blood. They talked about me. They said I was spoiled meat, but that I could be purified. They said the year of the beast would prepare the vessel. Ezekiel stopped reading. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The year of the beast, Ezekiel repeated. He looked at Catherine. That's what this is. Me. I am the beast in their ritual. Yes, Catherine whispered. They didn't put you in charge of me to humiliate my father, Ezekiel. That's just the cover story for society. She stepped closer, her eyes locking onto his. They put you in charge of me to purify me through suffering, to strip away my pride, my status, my humanity. They believe that by November, by the next harvest moon, you will be ready for the altar. Ezekiel finished. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The diet, the isolation, the medical intervention. It wasn't just cruelty. It was preparation. They were thinning her down, cleaning her out, not to cure her, but to make her a suitable sacrifice. She was the fatted calf, or rather, the starved one, being prepared for the slaughter. Silas isn't paying a debt with money. Ezekiel realized aloud, his voice rough. He's paying with you. And when they come for me in November, Catherine said, her voice trembling but resolute, I don't intend to be a victim. I intend to be the one holding the knife. Ezekiel closed the notebook. He shoved it into his waistband, against his skin. They think I am the beast, Ezekiel said, a dark smile forming on his lips, a smile that belonged to the man he used to be, the man who would burn the world for his children. They think I am just a tool to break you. He looked at Catherine. They have no idea that the beast and the vessel are talking. They have no idea we are sharpening each other. No, Catherine said. They don't. She reached out and touched his arm. It was the first time she had initiated contact without fear or aggression. We have 4 months until November, Ezekiel. 4 months to get strong. 4 months to figure out how to kill 13 of the most powerful men in South Carolina without getting caught. Ezekiel looked down at her hand on his arm. White skin on black skin. A connection that was illegal, taboo, and punishable by death in every direction. We won't just kill them, Ezekiel said softly. We're going to dismantle them. We're going to make them fear the dark before they die. He went to the loose floorboard under his bed, the only hiding place he had. He pulled out a small cloth sack. Inside were dried roots, water hemlock, nightshade, foxglove. He had been gathering them for weeks, harvesting death from the edges of the swamp. I know poisons, Ezekiel said. I know how to make a man's heart stop so it looks like sleep. I know how to make a man go mad so he tears out his own eyes. Catherine's eyes lit up with a terrifying hunger. Teach me. I will, Ezekiel promised. But first, you have to run. Run. You can walk the room, Ezekiel said, gesturing to the expanse of the carpet. But if you want to kill a man like Silas, you need to be faster than him, stronger than him. He went to the heavy oak wardrobe and pushed it. It scraped across the floor. Push it back, Ezekiel ordered. It's too heavy. Push it back, he roared, the thunder clapping outside in unison. Pretend it's him. Push. Catherine grit her teeth. She planted her feet. She slammed her shoulder into the wood. She groaned, her muscles straining, sweat popping on her forehead. She pushed. The wardrobe moved. An inch, then two. Again, Ezekiel shouted. And in the heart of the storm, amidst the lightning and the rain, the training truly began. The plantation slept, dreaming of cotton and rice, while upstairs, the revolution was doing push-ups. The Dog Days. August in the Low Country was known as the Dog Days. It was a time when the heat drove dogs mad and made men vicious. The air was a wet blanket of steam that never lifted, not even at night. The rice fields churned with mosquitoes, and the snakes moved up from the swamps, seeking higher, cooler ground. Inside the locked room at Cypress Grove, the atmosphere was kinetic. Catherine Rutledge hung from the top frame of her heavy oak four-poster bed. Her knuckles were white, gripping the wood. Her arms, once soft and doughy, now showed the faint, trembling definition of muscle. Pull, Ezekiel whispered. He stood nearby, listening for footsteps in the hallway. Catherine gritted her teeth. Sweat stung her eyes. She pulled. Her chin rose above the wooden beam. She held it there 1, 2, 3 seconds before lowering herself slowly. She dropped to the floor, breathing hard but silently. She wiped her face with her sleeve. That was 5, she panted. Last week I could only do 2. Strength returns, Ezekiel said, handing her a cup of water. But strength in a cage is just potential. You need to know if you can carry it. He moved to the window and peered through the crack in the curtains. The moon was a sliver, barely illuminating the grounds. The plantation was asleep, save for the occasional bark of a hound near the overseer's cabin. Tonight, Ezekiel said. Catherine froze. Outside. We cannot kill 13 men in this room, Catherine. You need to know the terrain. You need to know if your legs can carry you across the mud without failing. You need to know if you can move without sound. Fear flickered in her eyes, the old fear, the agoraphobia bred by years of confinement. What if we are seen? Then we die, Ezekiel said simply. But we are dead anyway come November if we do nothing. Put on your darkest dress. Tie your hair back. Take off your shoes. The night walk. The servants' stairs were treacherous in the dark. Every creak of the wood sounded like a gunshot. Catherine followed Ezekiel, stepping exactly where he stepped. She was barefoot, her feet sensing the grit and dust of the floorboards. They reached the back door. Ezekiel greased the hinges with a bit of lard he had stolen from the kitchen. The door opened with a sigh. The wall of heat hit them instantly. It smelled of tidal rot, jasmine, and pine resin. For Catherine, it was sensory overload. The sound of the crickets was deafening. The darkness was vast. Not like the contained darkness of her room. Stay low, Ezekiel commanded. They moved into the shadows of the azalea bushes lining the house. Ezekiel moved with a predator's grace. Catherine was clumsier, wincing as twigs dug in her bare feet, but she kept up. They skirted the edge of the formal gardens and reached the tree line. Here, the ground turned soft and damp. Run, Ezekiel whispered. To the big oak. Go. Catherine ran. It wasn't elegant. She stumbled. Her breath came in ragged gasps. But she was running. For the first time in 10 years, she was moving faster than a walk. The wind rushed past her ears. She felt the blood pumping hot and alive in her veins. She reached the oak tree and leaned against it, her chest heaving. Ezekiel appeared beside her a moment later, barely winded. How does it feel? He asked. Catherine looked up at the stars through the Spanish moss. It feels dangerous. Good. Keep that feeling. Suddenly, Ezekiel's hand clamped over her mouth. He shoved her hard against the rough bark of the tree, pressing his body against hers to hide her white skin in the shadows. Still, he breathed into her ear. Voices. 2 men were walking along the perimeter path, swinging a lantern. One carried a shotgun. It was Henderson, the overseer, and a new man Silas had hired to watch the barns. Told him the drainage in the north field is backed up. Henderson was grumbling. But Rutledge don't care about the rice right now. He's obsessed with that house. Obsessed with the girl. Reckon she's dying? The new man asked. Cook says she don't eat nothing. Says the tray comes back empty, but the chamber pot don't show it. She's dying or she's crazy. Henderson spat, pausing 10 yards from where Catherine and Ezekiel were hidden. Either way, come winter, I bet this place is up for sale. Rutledge is leveraged to his eyeballs. The beam of the lantern swept across the trees. The light caught the moss hanging just above Catherine's head. Catherine stopped breathing. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought the men must hear it. Ezekiel was a statue, his eyes fixed on a shotgun. His free hand slowly moved to his belt, where he had a sharpened piece of iron hidden. If they saw them, Ezekiel would have to kill them. Both of them. Quickly. The lantern lingered. A mosquito landed on Catherine's cheek. She didn't twitch. Come on, Henderson said, swatting at a bug. Mosquitoes are fierce tonight. Let's check the stables. The lights swung away. The footsteps faded. Ezekiel didn't move for a full minute. Then, slowly, he released Catherine. She slumped against the tree, trembling. But it wasn't the trembling of the palsy she used to have. It was the adrenaline of the hunt. I could have done it, she whispered, her voice shaking but surprised. If they had seen us, I was looking for a rock. I was ready to strike. Ezekiel looked at her in the dark. He saw the change. The victim was gone. The survivor had arrived. Let's go back, he said, before our luck runs out. The inspection. 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday in September, the true test arrived. It was not a test of strength, but of submission. A black carriage with silver trim rolled up the drive. It did not bear the Rutledge crest, but the seal of the judiciary. Thomas, the butler, came to find Ezekiel in the garden. Thomas looked pale. Clean yourself up, Thomas hissed. And get upstairs. Judge Pelham is here. He wants to see her. Ezekiel's blood ran cold. Judge Pelham, one of the names in the journal, one of the men from the cellar. He hurried upstairs. Catherine was pacing. She had heard the carriage. It's Pelham, Ezekiel said, closing the door. He's coming up. Catherine's face went white, then hard. The judge. You have to act, Ezekiel said urgently. You have to be the broken thing they think you are. If he sees the muscle, if he sees the clarity in your eyes, he will know. He will tell the brethren the sacrifice is tainted. I can't, she said, panic rising. I want to tear his throat out. Not today. Ezekiel grabbed her shoulders. Today you are fog. Today you're nothing. Do you understand? Hide the fire. Footsteps on the stairs. Heavy, confident boots. Catherine scrambled into the chair. She slumped her body. She unbuttoned the top of her dress slightly to look disheveled. She let her mouth hang open. She stared at a spot on the wall and unfocused her eyes until the room blurred. The door opened. Silas Rutledge walked in, looking nervous and obsequious. Behind him strode Judge Archibald Pelham. Pelham was a bear of a man, with mutton chop whiskers and a stomach that strained his waistcoat. He smelled of tobacco and expensive cologne. He carried a silver-tipped cane. Well, Pelham boomed, his voice filling the room. Let us see the vessel. Silas gestured to the chair. As you can see, Judge, the treatment is rigorous. She has lost significant mass. Pelham walked over to Catherine. He stood directly in front of her. He poked her thigh with his cane. Lean, he observed. Very lean. The fat of the corruption is melting away. Catherine stared at the wall. She didn't blink. Inside, she was screaming. Pelham leaned down. His face was inches from hers. Catherine, do you know me? Catherine let a low moan escape her lips. She turned her head sluggishly, looking through him. Papa, the spiders. The spider's away. Silas sighed theatrically. Her mind is largely gone. She speaks only nonsense. Good, Pelham said. The mind is an obstacle. We need only the spirit and the flesh. Then, Pelham did something that made Ezekiel's vision go red. He reached out with a gloved hand and grabbed Catherine's jaw. He forced her mouth open, turning her head side to side like a horse trader inspecting teeth. Gums are pale, Pelham muttered. Anemia. That is acceptable. The bloodletting will be easier if the pressure is low. He ran his hand down her neck, feeling the tendons. He let his hand linger on her shoulder, squeezing the flesh. She is firming up, Pelham said, a disturbing appreciation in his tone. Less blubber, more gristle. The knife will pass cleanly. Catherine's hands were hidden in the folds of her dress. Her fingernails were digging into her palms, so hard they drew blood. She was vibrating with the effort to not bite his gloved hand, to not snap his thumb. Ezekiel stood in the corner, head bowed, hands clasped behind his back. He was watching Pelham's throat. throat. He was calculating exactly how much force it would take to crush the windpipe. 3 pounds of pressure, just a twist, but he stayed still. He forced himself to be the furniture. Pelham released Catherine. He wiped his glove on his trousers. She is readying well. Silas, Pelham nodded. November 2nd. The moon will be full. The brethren are pleased with your commitment. Thank you, Judge, Silas said, sweating. Ensure the slave keeps her pliable, Pelham said, glancing at Ezekiel with total indifference. If she fights on the altar, it ruins the energy. She must be a willing participant or a totally broken one. I prefer broken. It's quieter. She will be ready, Silas promised. They turned and left. As the door clicked shut, silence rushed back into the room. Catherine didn't move for a long time. Then, she leaned forward and vomited bile onto the rug. Ezekiel was there instantly. He didn't clean the rug. He held her. I felt his pulse. Catherine gasped, wiping her mouth, her eyes burning with a terrifying light. When he grabbed my jaw, I felt the pulse in his wrist. It was slow, arrogant. She looked at Ezekiel. There were no tears, only ice. He wants broken, she hissed. I will break him. I will break every bone in his hand before I kill him. Ezekiel looked at the spot on her jaw where the red mark of Pelham's grip was fading. November 2nd, Ezekiel said, we have a date. He went to the loose floorboard and pulled out the small sack of herbs. He added a new item he had stolen from the garden shed, a file. A metal file. What is that for? Catherine asked. The cutlery, Ezekiel said. Tonight, we stop walking. Tonight, we start learning how to use a knife. The inspection was over. The enemy had shown his face, and in doing so, Judge Pelham had made a fatal error. He had confirmed that he did not see Catherine as a person, but as livestock. He didn't know that livestock could have fangs. The butcher's geometry. October arrived with a crisp, dry wind that stripped the leaves from the sycamores and turned the marsh grass into a sea of gold. The harvest was nearly complete. The barns were full. The air smelled of wood smoke and curing tobacco, and the plantation settled into the false peace of autumn. But inside the room on the second floor, there was no peace. There was only the grind of metal on stone. Ezekiel sat on the floor, the metal file moving rhythmically against a piece of iron he had pried from the fireplace grate. SCHHHD, SCHHHD, SCHHHD. Catherine stood in the center of the room. She was unrecognizable from the woman who had wept in the chair in April. She had lost nearly 80 pounds. Her dress hung on her frame, pinned back to fit. Her face was gaunt, the skin tight over high cheekbones, her eyes large and dark, burning with a cold, predatory intelligence. She held a piece of firewood wrapped in a cloth, a dummy target. Again, Ezekiel said, not looking up from his sharpening. Catherine lunged. It wasn't a wild swing. It was a step slide, silent and fast. She thrust a wooden spoon, her practice knife, upward under the ribs of the firewood log. Too low, Ezekiel critiqued. You hit the sternum. The bone will stop the blade. You have to find the gap. Soft tissue only. I'm trying, she hissed, wiping sweat from her forehead. Try harder. Judge Pelham is fat. He has layers of protection. You need to go for the neck or the groin. The femoral artery. It's here. Ezekiel tapped the inside of his own thigh. Cut that, and a man bleeds out in 3 minutes. He can't chase you. He can't scream. He just falls. This was the curriculum of October, the butcher's geometry. Ezekiel taught her the anatomy of death. He taught her that the human body is a machine of fluids and pressures, and if you open the right valve, the machine stops. He taught her how to hold a knife so it wouldn't slip when it hit resistance. He taught her how to cover a man's mouth from behind so he couldn't bite her hand. They are men, Ezekiel reminded her constantly. They are strong. They are arrogant, but they bleed like pigs. The alchemy of ruin. While Catherine trained her body, Ezekiel prepared the chemistry of their vengeance. He had spent months stealing small amounts of supplies. Sulfur from the garden shed, saltpeter from the curing barn, charcoal, and the herbs. On the table by the window, hidden under a pile of books, were 3 small clay jars. This one, Ezekiel pointed to the jar on the left, is monkshood, aconite. It causes paralysis. If we can get this into the wine, their tongues will go numb first, then their legs. They will be awake, but they won't be able to move. And this, Catherine pointed to the middle jar, filled with a gray powder. Datura, Ezekiel said, Jimson weed, the devil's trumpet. In high doses, it causes hallucinations. Terror. They will see their own sins coming for them. And the third, Ezekiel picked up the small jar. It contained a clear, odorless liquid he had distilled from the crushed kernels of peach pits and cherry laurel leaves. Cyanide, he whispered, concentrated. This is for the one you want to die instantly. No pain. Just off. Catherine looked at the jars. I don't don't want the third one. Not for them. I want them to feel it. I want the paralysis. I want them to know I am standing over them. And I want them to try to scream and fail. We will use the paralysis for the group, Ezekiel agreed. But we need the knife for the leaders. For Silas. For Pelham. Personal debts require personal payment. The final invitation. October 31st. Samhain. The day the veil between worlds is thinnest. The plantation was quiet. The enslaved workers had been given a half day, a rare benevolence from Silas, likely to keep them away from the main house for the evening's preparations. At 4 p.m., Thomas knocked on the door. Master, Silas requests the presence of Ezekiel Cross in the study, Thomas said through the wood. And he says to bring the patient's measurements. Ezekiel looked at Catherine. It's time. He went down to the study. The room was dark, lit only by the fireplace. Silas Rutledge stood by the hearth, reading a parchment scroll. He looked feverish, his eyes bright with a manic energy. Ezekiel, Silas said, not turning. Tomorrow night, November 2nd, the harvest moon. I am ready, sir. Is she? Silas turned. Is she broken? Is she empty? She is a ghost, sir. She barely speaks. She moves when I tell her. She stops when I tell her. She is a vessel waiting to be filled. Excellent. Silas handed Ezekiel a folded piece of paper. These are the instructions for the ritual of inversion. Study them. You have a role. Ezekiel took the paper. You will bathe her tomorrow at sunset, Silas commanded. Oils of rosemary and hyssop. You will dress her in the white linen shift I have had prepared. She is to wear no shoes. No yueli. Silas stepped closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. At 9 p.m., the bell will toll 3 times. You will bring her to the carriage house, not the cellar. The cellar is too small for what we have planned this year. We are using the old barn, the one near the river. Ezekiel nodded. The old barn. Wooden structure. Draiai. Flammable. And Ezekiel? Silas smiled. A twist of lips that looked like a scar. You will carry her in. You will place her on the altar. And then you will be given a knife. Ezekiel kept his face stone. A knife, sir. Part of the ritual, Silas said, his eyes gleaming. The beast must mark the vessel. A small cut, a symbolic opening of the flesh, to show that the animal controls the human. After that, the brethren take over. Silas chuckled. It is a great honor, boy. You will be the first of your kind to hold steel in a brethren circle. Don't disappoint me. I won't, sir, Ezekiel said. He turned to leave. Oh, and Ezekiel? Ezekiel paused at the door. After the ritual, you will be sold. Henderson has a buyer in the Indies. Sugar cane fields. It's a death sentence, really, but you've done good work. Ezekiel didn't flinch. Thank you, sir. The War Council. Ezekiel returned to the room. He locked the door. He handed the paper to Catherine. The old barn, he said, near the river. Catherine read the instructions, her hand steady. The barn is old. The timber is dry. It's full of haylofts. It's a tinderbox, Ezekiel said. If we light it, it goes up in minutes. 13 men, Catherine calculated. 1 in trance. The big double doors. There's a smaller door in the back, near the stalls. I will jam the back door, Ezekiel said. Tonight, I'll slip out and wedge it shut. And the front doors? We lock them in, Ezekiel said. With us inside or from the outside? Inside, Catherine said coldly. I want to see their faces. Ezekiel shook his head. No, that is suicide. We need a way out. There's a hay chute in the loft. It drops into the river mud. That is our exit. They laid out the plan on the floor, using pieces of coal to draw the barn. 9 p.m., entry. 9:15 p.m., the presentation. 9:20 p.m., the marking. That is the signal, Ezekiel said, pointing to the coal mark. Silas said, I am to cut you. A symbolic cut. When he handed me the knife, that is when we start. Do not cut me, Catherine said. I have to make it look real. Just a scratch. No. Catherine reached into the folds of her dress and pulled out the iron spike Ezekiel had sharpened. She had sewn a sheath into the lining of her shift. When he hands you the knife, you take it. You turn. You kill the closest man. I will take Silas. Silas is mine, Ezekiel growled. Silas is ours. Catherine corrected. But the priority is survival. We kill the guards first, then the brethren. We use the datura powder to confuse them. I will sew packets of it into my sleeves. When I raise my arms, I scatter it into the candles. It will flash. It will create smoke. Flash powder, Ezekiel nodded. Magnesium shavings mixed with the herbs. I have some. Smoke. Confusion. Screams. Catherine's eyes were wide, visualizing the carnage. And then fire. Ezekiel looked at her. She was terrifying. She was magnificent. She was nothing like the woman he had met in April. One thing, Ezekiel said softly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the cloth with his family's names. He placed it on the table. If we die tomorrow, Ezekiel said, if this goes wrong, I want you to know, you gave me a reason to breathe again. Catherine looked at the names. Sarah, Benjamin, Ruth. She reached out and placed her hand over his. We won't die, she said. We are the harvest, Ezekiel, and they are the wheat. And tomorrow, we thrash them. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the window panes. The sun began to set on October 31st. November was coming, the month of the dead. Ezekiel went to the window and looked out toward the river, toward the dark silhouette of the old barn. Rest, he told Catherine. Eat the meat I brought. You need the energy. I'm not hungry. Eat, he commanded gently. Tomorrow night, you feast. Catherine took the dried beef. She chewed slowly, her eyes never leaving the drawing of the barn on the floor. The trap was set. The bait was ready. The only question remained. Who would be left standing when the smoke cleared? The inversion. The sun died early on November 2nd, strangled by a bank of purple clouds that bruised the western horizon. By nightfall, the air turned unseasonably cold, a biting chill that rose from the Combahee River and seeped into the bones. At 8:45 p.m., the heavy iron bell near the overseer's cabin tolled once, then twice, then 3 times. Inside the room, the sound vibrated through the floorboards. Ezekiel stood by the door. He wore rough-spun trousers and a loose linen shirt, open at the throat. He was barefoot. In a waistband of his trousers, at the small of his back, the file-sharpened iron spike was tucked against his skin. Catherine stood in the center of the room. She wore a simple white shift, thin as gauze. Her hair was loose, washed and brushed until it shone like obsidian in the candlelight. She looked fragile. She looked like a ghost. But beneath the shift, taped to the insides of her wrists, were the packets of flash powder and dechira dust. "It is time," Ezekiel said. His voice was a low rumble, steady as a heartbeat. Catherine looked at him. Her face was a mask of vacant stupor, the broken vessel, but her eyes were clear and sharp. "Remember," she whispered, "the flash first, then the blood. I won't miss." The door opened. Silas Rutledge stood there. He was dressed in a long black robe, holding a lantern. His face was pale, his eyes wide and dilated, fueled by adrenaline and perhaps a touch of the laudanum he usually fed his daughter. "Bring her," Silas commanded. Ezekiel walked over to Catherine. She let her body go limp, sagging against him. He scooped her up into his arms. She was light now, stripped of the weight of her oppression, stripped down to muscle and bone. As he lifted her, her hand brushed his neck. It was a calculated touch, a signal. "I am with you." They walked out of the room, down the grand staircase, and into the night. The procession. The walk to the old barn was a funeral march. The path was lined with torches staked into the mud, their flames whipping in the river wind. The shadows they cast were long and jagged, dancing like demons on the grass. Ezekiel carried Catherine with an easy strength. He stared straight ahead, playing the part of the automaton. They approached the barn. It was a massive structure of black cypress wood, looming against the starless sky like a great sleeping beast. The smell hit them first: sweet hay, old manure, and the sharp chemical tang of sulfur and incense. The double doors were open. Inside, it was not dark. It was blazing. Dozens of black candles were arranged in a wide circle on the dirt floor. At the center of the circle stood a large, flat slab of stone, an old millstone repurposed as an altar. Surrounding the circle stood 12 men. They wore robes of crimson and black. Their faces were hidden behind masks made of burlap and leather, crude and terrifying. Some had horns sewn onto them. Others had beaks. They stood in silence, watching the entrance. Silas Rutledge walked into the center of the circle. He did not wear a mask. He was the supplicant. He was the debtor. "Brothers," Silas shouted, his voice cracking with manic fervor. "Tonight, the wheel turns. Tonight, the order is inverted." A low chant began from the 12 men. It was a guttural, rhythmic sound, more vibration than language. "Subra, infra, sanguis, terra." Silas gestured to Ezekiel. "Bring the vessel to the stone." Ezekiel stepped across the threshold. The air inside was hot and suffocating. He walked through the gap in the circle of men. He felt their eyes on him, eyes filled with contempt, lust, and violence. He reached the millstone. It was cold and rough. He lowered Catherine onto it. She lay back, her hair fanning out like a dark halo. She stared up at the rafters, her mouth slightly open, her chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked breaths. It was a perfect performance of terrorized submission. Silas loomed over her. "Daughter of my blood," Silas intoned, reciting the ritual text. "You who are burden, you who are weakness. Tonight you become the payment. Tonight you wash the ledger clean." He turned to the circle. The inversion requires that the lowest rise above the highest. Silas screamed that the beast consumes the beauty, that the slave marks the master. One of the masked men stepped forward. By his girth and the heavy silver ring on his finger, Ezekiel recognized Judge Pelham. Pelham held a velvet cushion. On it lay a knife. It wasn't a kitchen knife. It was an ancient thing, the handle carved from bone, the blade curved and gleaming in the candlelight. Ezekiel cross. Silas turned to him. "Step forward." Ezekiel moved to the head of the altar. He stood over Catherine. "You have been her keeper," Silas said, his voice trembling with the power he thought he held. "You have broken her spirit. Now break her flesh." Silas picked up the knife. He held it out, handle first, to Ezekiel. "Take the blade. Make the mark of the harvest on her chest. Spill the royal blood, so the earth may drink." The chanting grew louder. The men in the circle began to stomp their feet. Thud, thud, thud. Ezekiel looked at the knife. Then he looked at Silas. For a second, time seemed to stretch. The air crackled with tension. Ezekiel reached out. His large hand closed around the bone handle. The weapon felt heavy, balanced, real. "Do it!" Pelham shouted from behind his mask. "Cut the sow." Ezekiel looked down at Catherine. She was no longer staring at the rafters. She was looking directly at him. Her eyes were hard as flint. She gave a microscopic nod. Now, the spark. The change happened in the space between heartbeats. Ezekiel did not lean down. He did not cut Catherine. Instead, he roared, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage that shattered the chanting instantly. He spun on his heel. The movement was a blur of violence. With all the force of his torso, he drove the bone-handled knife not into the girl, but upward and outward. Shathunk. The blade buried itself to the hilt in the chest of the man standing closest to him, Silas Rutledge. Silas's eyes went wide. His mouth opened to scream, but only a wet gurgle came out. He looked down at the handle protruding from his sternum in disbelief. "The debt is paid," Ezekiel snarled. At the exact same moment, Catherine sat up on the altar. She didn't look like a ghost anymore. She looked like a banshee. She threw her arms wide, snapping her wrists. The packets of flash powder and datura dust exploded from her sleeves, showering into the circle of black candles. Whoosh! A blinding sheet of white magnesium fire erupted in the center of the barn. It was brighter than the sun, searing the retinas of every man in the circle. "My eyes!" someone screamed. Sorcery! Thick, acrid smoke billowed instantly, laced with the hallucinogenic datura. The barn dissolved into chaos. "Run!" Ezekiel shouted to Catherine. He shoved the dying body of Silas Rutledge into Judge Pelham, knocking the heavy man backward into the dirt. Catherine slid off the altar. She didn't run for the door. She ran for the shadows. She reached into her shift and pulled out her iron spike. A masked man, Reverend Crenshaw, by the smell of him, lunged at her through the smoke, swinging a heavy cane. "You bitch!" he screamed. Catherine didn't flinch. She dropped low, sliding on the dirt, using the move Ezekiel had taught her. She dodged the cane and drove the spike upward. It went into his groin. Crenshaw shrieked, a high, womanish sound, and crumpled. "The door!" Ezekiel yelled. He was fighting two men now. He had lost the knife in Silas's chest, but he was a giant among soft men. He caught a fist, twisted an arm until the bone snapped, and used the screaming man as a shield against the others. "No!" Catherine shouted back, her voice cutting through the smoke. "Lock it!" She scrambled toward the massive double doors. The confusion was total. The brethren were blind, coughing, swinging wildly at shadows. They hadn't realized yet that the sheep were wolves. Catherine reached the doors. She slammed one shut, then the other. She dropped the heavy oak bar into place. Thud! She turned back to the room. The flash powder was fading, replaced by the ominous orange glow of the hay, beginning to catch fire from the overturned candles. Ezekiel stood by the altar, breathing hard, surrounded by enemies. Silas Rutledge lay dead at his feet. Catherine smiled. It was a terrible smile. "Now," she whispered, pulling a second packet of powder from her hem. "Now we teach them about hell." The barn was sealed. The fire was lit. And inside, 13 of the most powerful men in the county were trapped with two people who had absolutely nothing left to lose. The ritual of inversion was complete. The prey had become the hunters. The devil's smoke. The old barn was no longer a structure of wood and hay. It was a throat, and it was swallowing them whole. The fire started in the dry straw scattered around the altar, ignited by the overturned candles. It caught with a terrifying speed, racing up the wooden pillars toward the loft where tons of cured hay sat waiting like a bomb. But the fire was the least of the brethren's problems. The smoke from the flash powder and the burning datura, Jimson weed, hung in the air, a thick, acrid fog that smelled of burnt magnesium and rotted flowers. The men, panic-stricken and hyperventilating, were inhaling deep lungfuls of the potent hallucinogen. "Demons!" screamed Marcus Fanning, clawing at his own face. "They are crawling out of the floor." Fanning fell to his knees, thrashing at invisible snakes. He wasn't seeing the dirt floor. He was seeing the writhing bodies of the people he had sold downriver. Ezekiel moved through the chaos like a phantom. The smoke stung his eyes, but he held his breath, fighting in short, controlled bursts. He grabbed a heavy iron candelabra from the ground. A masked figure lunged at him, Dr. Arrington wielding a ceremonial dagger. Ezekiel didn't dodge. He stepped inside the guard, swinging the heavy iron base of the candelabra. It connected with the side of Arrington's head with a sickening crack. The doctor crumpled, his mask slipping sideways to reveal eyes rolled back in his head. "Catherine!" Ezekiel roared, his voice competing with the roar of the flames. "To the ladder!" The inspection ends. Catherine heard him, but she was occupied. She was standing near the bar double doors, a wraith in a white shift now stained with soot and blood. She held her iron spike in a reverse grip. Judge Archibald Pelham had not succumbed to the panic. His sheer bulk and rage seemed to anchor him against the hallucinations. He saw Catherine, not a demon, but the woman who had trapped him. "You whore!" Pelham bellowed. He charged her, leading with his silver-tipped cane. He swung it like a club. Catherine ducked, the silver head smashing into the wood of the door inches from her skull. Splinters rained down on her hair. Pelham was fast for a big man. He dropped the cane and grabbed her by the throat. His hand, the same hand that had squeezed her jaw during the inspection, clamped down on her windpipe. He lifted her off her feet, pinning her against the burning door. "I will snap your neck," Pelham spat, his face purple, his eyes bulging. "I will squeeze the life out of you slowly." Catherine kicked, her bare feet finding no purchase. Her vision began to spot. The fire roared behind Pelham, framing him like a devil. Soft tissue. Ezekiel's voice echoed in her mind. The machine stops. Catherine stopped thrashing. She let her body go limp for a split second, tricking Pelham into thinking she was fading. He loosened his grip just a fraction to gloat. "Weak," he hissed. In that second, Catherine brought her right hand up. She didn't stab blindly. She drove the sharpened iron spike directly into the soft flesh of Pelham's armpit, deep into the brachial plexus, severing the nerves and the artery. Pelham screamed, a sound of shock more than pain. His grip instantly failed. His arm went dead. Catherine dropped to the floor. She didn't run. She looked up at him. "Weak," she gasped, massaging her throat. Pelham looked at his useless arm, blood pulsing dark and fast onto his velvet robe. He looked back at her, fear finally piercing his arrogance. Catherine lunged forward, driving her knee into his groin. As he doubled over, she grabbed his hair, pulled his head down, and whispered into his ear, "November is here, Judge." She shoved him backward. He stumbled, his balance gone, and fell into the circle of fire consuming the altar. His robes caught instantly. His screams joined the chorus of the damned. The ascent. "Move!" Ezekiel grabbed Catherine's arm. The heat was becoming unbearable. The skin on their faces felt tight and dry. The smoke was banking down from the ceiling, a suffocating gray blanket. They ran toward the back of the barn, weaving through the carnage. It was a scene from Hieronymus Bosch. 12 of the most powerful men in the county were reduced to madness. Some were weeping, curled in balls. Others were fighting each other, convinced their brothers were monsters. One man was trying to climb the wall, tearing his fingernails out on the rough wood. Silas Rutledge's body lay near the altar, already being consumed by the flames. He was becoming ash, just as the prophecy foretold, though not in the way he had intended. Ezekiel and Catherine reached the ladder leading to the hayloft. "Up!" Ezekiel commanded. "Go!" Catherine scrambled up the wooden rungs. Her lungs were burning. The heat was rising with them. They tumbled onto the floor of the loft. The air here was hotter, thick with the smell of roasting grain. The fire had reached the roof beams above them. Burning embers rained down like fiery snow. "The chute," Ezekiel pointed. At the far end of the loft was a square opening in the floor, used to pitch hay down to the river barges or wagons below. It was a black square against the glowing orange of the burning hay. They ran for it. The floorboards beneath them groaned, weakened by the fire raging below. Just as they reached the edge of the chute, the roof gave way. A massive burning beam crashed down behind them, blocking the way back. The barn shuddered. The entire structure groaned, tilting slightly toward the river. Ezekiel looked down the chute. It was a 20-foot drop into the mud and shallow water of the riverbank. He looked at Catherine. Her face was streaked with soot, blood, and sweat. She looked wild. She looked alive. "Together," Ezekiel said. He took her hand. "Together," she echoed. They didn't look back at the inferno. They didn't look back at the screaming men. They stepped into the void, the river. They hit the mud with a wet, bone-jarring thud. They rolled, momentum carrying them down the slick bank and into the cold, black water of the Combahee. The shock of the cold was violent. It snapped them back back to reality, washing away the heat and the smoke. They surfaced, gasping, treading water as the current tugged at their clothes. They looked up. The old barn was a torch. Flame shot 50 feet into the air, punching a hole in the night sky. The cypress wood burned fiercely, crackling and popping like gunfire. The screams from inside had stopped. The structure groaned one last time, then collapsed inward with a sound like a thunderclap. A geyser of sparks rose up, swirling into the darkness to join the stars. Ezekiel and Catherine drifted downstream, holding onto a piece of driftwood. They watched the destruction of their prison. "It's gone," Catherine whispered, her teeth chattering from the adrenaline crash and the cold water. "It's all gone." "Not all," Ezekiel said, looking toward the main house in the distance. "Just a rot." They let the river carry them for a mile, putting distance between themselves and the inevitable arrival of the slave patrols and neighbors. Finally, Ezekiel kicked toward the far bank, the side opposite the plantation, the side that led into the deep pine forests and the swamps. They dragged themselves out of the water, collapsing into the reeds. They lay there for a long time, shivering, breathing the clean, cold air. Ezekiel sat up first. He checked Catherine. She was bruised. Her neck was already turning purple where Pelham had grabbed her. Her feet were cut, but she was whole. "We can't stay," Ezekiel said gently. "They will see the fire for miles. Men will come." Catherine sat up. She wrung the water out of her hair. She looked back across the river one last time. "Let them come," she said. "They won't find Catherine Rutledge. She died in that fire." "And Ezekiel Cross? He died too," she said, turning to him. "We're ghosts now, Ezekiel, and ghosts can go anywhere." Ezekiel reached into his wet pocket. The paper was mush, dissolving in his fingers. The names, Sarah, Benjamin, Ruth, were gone. But he didn't need the paper anymore. The debt to the past was paid. Now, there was only the future. "Where do we go?" Catherine asked. Ezekiel looked north, toward the deep woods, toward the underground railroad routes he had learned about in Virginia, toward a life that would be hard, hunted, but free. "We go," Ezekiel said, standing and offering her his hand. "Where the fire can't find us." Catherine took his hand. They turned their backs on the smoking ruin of the Cypress Grove plantation and walked into the trees, disappearing into the American night. Epilogue. The investigation into the fire at Cypress Grove was brief and horrified. The coroner identified 13 bodies, though the heat had made identification difficult. It was assumed that a tragic accident had occurred during a private gentleman's gambling gathering. The official story was that Catherine Rutledge, the mad daughter, had also perished in the blaze, along with the slave tasked with guarding her. But in the slave quarters, a different story was whispered. Judith swore that 2 days after the fire, she found a small carving on the mounting block near the stables. It was a crude depiction of a bird breaking out of a cage. And months later, far to the north, in a free settlement in Ohio, a man and a woman arrived. He was a carpenter with hands that could build or destroy. She was a teacher with a scar on her neck and a fierce, quiet demeanor. They called themselves Mr. and Mrs. Freeman. They didn't speak of the South. They didn't speak of fire. But sometimes, when the autumn moon was full and orange, they would sit on their porch, holding hands, and watch the corn sway in the wind, knowing that the harvest, finally, belonged to them.